The Lambert family was one of old money, their wealth stretching back generations, with each generation adding to the family fortune. At the heart of this legacy was the patriarch, Charles Lambert, a man who had grown his family's wealth to unprecedented heights through his vast empire of businesses and real estate. Now, in his twilight years, Charles was bedridden, his health failing rapidly, and his once formidable presence reduced to a frail shadow. Charles had 3 children. Jonathan, the eldest, was groomed from birth to take over the family empire. He was ambitious, calculating, and he had spent his entire life under the weight of expectation. Caroline, the middle child, was an accomplished artist, always the free spirit, more interested in her craft than in the family business. And the youngest, Henry, had rebelled against the family's expectations and become a successful environmental activist, often clashing with Jonathan over the ethical responsibilities of their wealth. As Charles's condition worsened, the matter of his will became a topic of tense discussion among the siblings. Jonathan, always a strategist, saw the division of the inheritance as an obstacle to his plans for expanding the empire. He believed he was the rightful heir to the entire fortune, given his lifelong dedication to the family business. But Charles, who had always been weary of Jonathan's ambition, had made it clear that the inheritance would be divided equally among the 3 siblings. On the eve of their father's death, the Lambert siblings gathered in the family mansion, a grand estate that had been in the family for centuries. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, each sibling dealing with their grief and anticipation in their own way. Jonathan, however, was focused solely on one thing, ensuring that he got what he believed was his due. As Charles slipped away in the night, the family's lawyer arrived the next morning to read the will. As expected, the estate was to be divided equally, with specific assets designated for each child. Jonathan would receive control of the family businesses. However, Henry would inherit a significant portion of the estate, including the art collection, while Caroline would receive a large sum of money, along with the rights to several properties. The children, in confusion as to why they inherited parts of their father's wealth they had no interest in, made them squabble. However, Charles, their father, did this for a specific reason they will eventually understand. But Jonathan was not satisfied with running the business alone. He wanted it all. So, as the lawyer concluded the reading, Jonathan's mind began to race. He knew that with the right moves, he could manipulate his siblings and secure the entire fortune for himself. And so, as the family mourned their loss, Jonathan began to plot, setting the stage for a scheme that would pit him against his own blood in a ruthless game of greed. Jonathan wasted no time in setting his plan into motion. He knew that his siblings, particularly Caroline and Henry, were not as interested in the family fortune as he was, and he intended to use that to his advantage. His first step was to isolate them, to drive a wedge between them, and to make them question each other's intentions. He started by subtly planting doubts in Caroline's mind about Henry's motives. Caroline had always been the emotional core of the family, close to both of her brothers, despite their differences. But she was also sensitive and easily swayed by those she trusted. Jonathan played on these traits, casually mentioning that Henry had expressed interest in selling off some of the properties he had inherited. He told me that he needs the money to fund his environmental projects. Jonathan said over a glass of wine one evening, "But I wonder if he's really doing it for the cause, or if he's just trying to cash out as quickly as possible." Caroline frowned, unsure of what to think. She knew Henry was passionate about his work, but the idea of selling off pieces of the family's legacy without consulting them troubled her. Jonathan's words planted the first seeds of doubt, and that was all he needed. Next, Jonathan turned his attention to Henry. He knew his younger brother was idealistic and driven by a strong sense of justice, so he decided to play on Henry's disdain for the corporate world and his belief that Jonathan was too ruthless in his business dealings. During a casual conversation, Jonathan mentioned that Caroline had expressed concerns about Henry's plans for the properties. "She's worried. You're going to destroy what's left of the family's legacy," he said, feigning concern. "She thinks you might be making decisions that are too rash, too focused on your own goals." Henry, who had always felt like the black sheep of the family, bristled at the suggestion. He had always admired Caroline's free spirit, but now he began to see her as someone who didn't understand the importance of his work. The idea that she was questioning his motives hurt him deeply, and he began to distance himself from her, believing that she didn't trust him. As the weeks passed, Jonathan's manipulation took root. Caroline and Henry, once close, began to drift apart, each harboring doubts about the other's intentions. Jonathan watched with satisfaction as his siblings grew more distant, knowing that the time was drawing near for him to make his next move. With the seeds of deceit firmly planted, Jonathan prepared to take control of the family fortune by any means necessary, even if it meant betraying those he had once called family. With the seeds of distrust growing between Caroline and Henry, Jonathan began to tighten his grip on the family fortune. He knew that in order to secure his position, he would need to act quickly before his siblings could see through his manipulation. The next step in his plan was to control the narrative of the family's wealth and to isolate his siblings from the family's business dealings. Jonathan started by arranging a series of emergency meetings with the board of directors of the family's companies. He intentionally excluded Caroline and Henry from these meetings, citing their lack of experience in business matters. To the board, he portrayed himself as the only competent heir capable of steering the company through the turbulent times that often followed the death of a powerful patriarch. He emphasized the need for strong, decisive leadership and subtly suggested that his siblings were not equipped to handle the responsibilities that came with their inheritance. Meanwhile, Jonathan continued to manipulate Caroline and Henry, further straining their relationship. He began leaking false information to both of them, suggesting that the other was planning to make drastic changes to their inherited assets without consulting them. He told Caroline that Henry was planning to sell off her beloved art collection to fund his environmental causes, and he told Henry that Caroline was considering liquidating the properties he had inherited to invest in art projects. As the tension between the siblings escalated, Jonathan proposed a solution that he knew would benefit only himself. He suggested that given their different interests, it might be best if they each took full control of their respective inheritances. Caroline over the art and estate properties, Henry over the liquid assets and real estate, and Jonathan over the business empire. On the surface, it seemed like a fair division, but in reality, it would give Jonathan the leverage he needed to gain full control over the family's wealth. Caroline, overwhelmed by the strain of managing her inheritance and feeling increasingly isolated, agreed to the proposal. Henry, disillusioned by what he perceived as Caroline's selfishness, also agreed, believing it was the only way to maintain control over the assets he cared about. With both siblings on board, Jonathan swiftly moved to finalize the arrangements, knowing that once the division was complete, he would have the power to manipulate the family fortune as he saw fit. But as Jonathan's web of deceit tightened around his siblings, cracks began to form in his carefully constructed plan. Unbeknownst to him, Caroline had begun to suspect that something was amiss. She had noticed inconsistencies in the information she was receiving and began to question whether Jonathan was truly acting in the family's best interests. Quietly, she started investigating the situation, determined to uncover the truth before it was too late. As Caroline delved deeper into the family's affairs, she began to uncover the extent of Jonathan's manipulations. She found discrepancies in the financial records, signs that Jonathan had been diverting funds from the family businesses into accounts under his sole control. She also discovered that many of the emergency meetings Jonathan had attended were not as urgent as he had claimed, and that decisions were being made without her or Henry's input. The realization of her brother's betrayal hit Caroline hard. She had always trusted Jonathan, believing that despite their differences, he had the family's best interests at heart. Now she saw him for what he truly was, a man consumed by greed, willing to sacrifice anything, including his own family, to secure his place at the top. But Caroline knew she couldn't confront him directly, not without risking everything. She needed to gather more evidence, and more importantly, she needed to bring Henry back into the fold. Caroline reached out to Henry cautiously at first, knowing that the relationship had become strained due to Jonathan's manipulations. She began by sharing some of the information she had uncovered, carefully choosing her words to avoid pushing him away. Henry, initially skeptical, listened as Caroline presented her findings. The more she spoke, the more he realized that he had been played as well, that Jonathan had used his insecurities and passions against him. The siblings, once divided, now found common ground in their shared betrayal. They agreed to work together to expose Jonathan's deceit and to reclaim control of their inheritance, but they knew that they had to act carefully. Jonathan was cunning, and any misstep could give him the upper hand. Over the next few weeks, Caroline and Henry quietly gathered evidence, working behind the scenes to undermine Jonathan's control. They reached out to trusted family advisors and board members, sharing their concerns and slowly building a coalition of support. At the same time, they began to document Jonathan's actions, creating a detailed record of his manipulations and financial misdeeds. As evidence mounted, Jonathan began to sense that something was wrong. The board members who had once been firmly in his corner were now questioning his decisions, and he noticed that Caroline and Henry had started communicating more frequently. Paranoia began to set in, and Jonathan grew increasingly desperate to solidify his control before his siblings could strike back. But it was too late. Caroline and Henry had gathered enough evidence to confront Jonathan, and they were ready to make their move. They knew that the confrontation would be explosive, that it would likely tear the family apart, but they also knew it was the only way to stop Jonathan before he did irreparable damage. The stage was set for the final showdown, one that would determine the future of the Lambert family and the legacy that had been built over generations. The confrontation took place in the grand dining hall of the Lambert estate, a room that had seen countless family gatherings over the years, but this time there was no warmth or laughter, only the cold tension that hung in the air. Caroline and Henry stood together on one side of the long table, their faces set with determination. Jonathan, sensing that the tide had turned against him, stood on the other side, his expression a mix of anger and fear. Caroline began by laying out the evidence she and Henry had gathered. She spoke calmly but firmly, detailing Jonathan's manipulation of the family business, his attempts to pit them against each other, and the financial discrepancies that pointed to his greed. As she spoke, she handed over documents, bank statements, and records, each one a damning piece of evidence that showed the extent of Jonathan's betrayal. Jonathan tried to interrupt, to deny the accusations, but Caroline and Henry were prepared. Every lie he told was met with more evidence, more proof that he had been scheming behind their backs for months. The board members and family advisors who had been invited to witness the confrontation watched in silence, their expressions turning from disbelief to anger as the full scope of Jonathan's actions became clear. As the confrontation reached its peak, Jonathan's composure began to crumble. He lashed out, accusing Caroline and Henry of jealousy, of trying to steal what was rightfully his. But his words rang hollow, his desperation clear to everyone in the room. The more he spoke, the more he revealed his true nature. A man consumed by greed, willing to destroy his own family to achieve his ambitions. Finally, Henry spoke up, his voice steady and resolute. "Jonathan, you betrayed your family, our father's legacy, and everything we stand for. You've lost our trust, and you've lost your place in this family." With those words, the decision was made. The board members and the family advisors unanimously agreed to strip Jonathan of his control over the family businesses and to divide the assets equally between Caroline and Henry, as their father had intended. Jonathan, defeated and humiliated, was left with nothing but the bitter realization that his greed had cost him everything. As Jonathan was escorted out of the estate, Caroline and Henry stood together, united once more. They knew that the scars of Jonathan's betrayal would take time to heal, but they also knew that they had preserved their father's legacy and the values he had instilled in them. The Lambert family had been tested, but in the end, it was love and loyalty that had prevailed.